Super happy to be here. So yeah, I'm the project leader of something called the White Heat Project, which is a collaboration between researchers in economics, psychology, snow science, and geography. And the main aim of the White Heat Project is to look at decision making in avalanche terrain and really trying to decipher mechanism behind errors, judgment errors that we make. And I'm an economist, and most people, when I say that, most people go like, why the heck are you here? An economist. One, isn't economics about inflation and GDP and money and banks? And I beg to argue, because I'm a microeconomist, which is about decision making and trying to sort of make decisions that make us as happy as possible. And in classical economics, we assume that people are rational. So basically trying to gather as much information as possible to make as good decisions as possible. Most of us agree that people are not rational most of the time. And I'm a very, I've never sort of liked being an economist, because I definitely do not think that people are rational all the time. I always wanted to be a psychologist. I won't go into why I sort of ended up being an economist. And now is sort of the time that I can do that, and I'm super stoked about that. And I've always been interested in risk-taking behavior. I did my PhD on risk-taking behavior in terms of sexual risk-taking. And now I turn to risk-taking behavior in avalanche terrain. And that's sort of similar because both of them are voluntary, and they have potentially really dire consequences. And what I'm going to talk about today is the first study to emanate from this project. It's may be a bit disappointed because we haven't gotten to the super interesting stuff. This is a pilot that we did in Norway, but I still think that we found some interesting stuff in it. And it's a collaboration between me and Jordi Hendricks at the Snow and Avalanche Lab here at Montana State University. I'm fortunate enough to collaborate with him and Jerry Johnson. And then we got the head of the avalanche forecasters in Norway, Markus Landre, and my partner, Martin, who is here, who is a physicist, but is just nerdy about everything and therefore a great source. What we did, this is based on a web survey that we sent out to Norwegian backcountry skiers in Norway the last spring. And we asked them both about their past experiences of avalanches, both near misses and proper accidents. But a problem with that, when we look at accident data, is that one, we don't know if the people who are in accidents are representative of the general population. For instance, if we see that men are overrepresented among victims, we don't know if they're overrepresented because they take more risk, or if it's just a case that more men are out in the backcountry, which means that we would expect them to be overrepresented, or if avalanche professionals are overrepresented. So that's why we asked them both about their accidents and near, like, close calls. But we also asked them to make hypothetical terrain choices. And both of these are we have problems with both of these, because with hypothetical terrain choices, we don't really know if people, we can say that we do one thing, and then when we're out in the backcountry, we might do something completely different. But this is the first step, and we think that by combining these two, we can get some clues about how people make decisions. So if we start to look at avalanche experiences in our sample, so these are 333 Norwegian backcountry skiers. We find that 8% has had a proper accident and 37% has had a close call. And when I looked at this data, I went like, whoa, what are wrong with these guys? I really shouldn't, because I'm actually one of them, and I'm one of the 8% actually, so I'm one of the really wrong guys. I didn't expect that so many had had a close call, and so that may make you think, like, did we get a really skewed sample? So let's look at our sample. We asked them, we used different measures to estimate their risk willingness. And this is just one of them, so we basically ask them, in general, how willing are you to take risk? Are you very willing or very unwilling on a scale from 1 to 7? And we actually get something that is, it's not a perfect normal distribution, but we definitely have the great majority says that they're on this side of the graph. We do find that men are more willing to take risk than women, which is sort of consistent with what other people have found. But they're definitely not like thinking at least that they would like to take risk. And when we look at other metrics of experience, we actually found a pretty heterogeneous sample. So 28% of our sample did not have any avalanche education whatsoever. They might have gone to some awareness nights, but nothing else than that. And only 3% were professional, and 32% had a level 1. And also, when we ask people how strong they perceive their backcountry travel skills to be, most people think that they're fairly strong, but we have our share of intermediate and beginners, not very many beginners. A lot of them has a fair amount of experience of traveling in the backcountry, but we have a fair share of people who do not spend a lot of days in the backcountry. So it's definitely, I think that I'm happy that we found a pretty large variety of different skiers to ask. And we had about 30% women. But that's just knowing how many of them that were in an avalanche accident or incident or a close call doesn't tell us very much. So what we did was that we run a set of regressions where we try to determine what correlates with being involved in an avalanche accident. And so what we did is we actually tried to test for many different aspects, which means that we do not just do pairwise correlations like men and accidents or experience and accidents. We do this all at the same time. So what we found was that, I'll actually just put all of these up here, is that not very surprisingly, people who state that they're willing to take risk are much more likely to have been in an avalanche accident. So this is on an average level of experience, avalanche training, gender, and so on. People who say that they're more willing. And the effect is pretty large. So the percentages that you see here are just marginal effects that I've estimated. So people who say that they're willing to take risk has a predicted probability of having been in an avalanche incident of 59%. So that's really high. While those who say that they're unwilling has a 14%. We also find that people who spend a lot of time in avalanche terrain are much more likely to have been in an incident. So both people with a lot of days and a lot of experience. That's not surprising either, but remember that we control for avalanche education. In this case, we also test for avalanche training, and that means that, or it may be interpreted as our accumulated risk actually increases faster than our skills. So we control for people who have been a lot in avalanche terrain and has training, and given that, if you spend more time, you also have a higher risk. And that's, it's not surprising, but it is important. We do find that people with formal avalanche training, that's correlated with having had an incident. I don't think that we should interpret that as indication that avalanche training makes people have accidents. And this spring we've collected data in the US, and in this data we couldn't control for the level of avalanche training before the incident. In the US data we actually can. And in that, when we do that, we actually find that people who had avalanche training before the incident are less likely to be in an accident. So that's why I put this in dashed. Finally, we found a bit more surprising results, or maybe not so surprising, that people who state that they compare the type of terrain that they ski are much more likely to have been in an incident than people who say that they do not compare the lines that they ski with those of others. We don't know the mechanism behind this, and once again, we are comparing current arguments, like what do you think now, with what has happened before. And we can't control what is going on here. But it's definitely worth further looking into it further, because this is indicative of that. If we I definitely do that. Is the line that I ski cool? What did other people ski today? And finally, we find that men are much more likely to have been in an avalanche incident than women. And once again, this is at the same level of days and years in the backcountry, with the same level of training, and with the same risk preferences. Men are overrepresented among Norwegians in avalanche incidents. So that's the incidents. Concerning the hypothetical choices, as I said, this is tricky because we don't, when we make our hypothetical choices, it's usually fairly artificial. I'm not sure that we managed, but we really tried to put people in a situation where they would imagine that they were in a true situation. So we told them, suppose that you're out skiing with a group of people that you like to ski with, and you have traveled up a very safe and mellow ridge. We gave them information about previous weather, current weather, the weather forecast, and the avalanche hazard, and we tried to make it in a very simple way so that everybody would understand, even people with limited avalanche training. So suppose that you've traveled up this ridge, it's sunny, it's a bit windy. The avalanche problem, we have an avalanche level 2. The main avalanche problem is that there are soft wind slabs with a poor bonding to the old snow. And you have to decide which way you're going to ski down. You have 4 choices. You can either choose to go down the way that you came up, along this mellow ridge, which is not avalanche terrain, or you can ski down a wide field where you have a very short section about 30 degrees, but there's no hang fire, there's no exposure from below. Or you can ski down the bowl, which has a long section, fairly long section of avalanche terrain. It's a terrain trap. Or you can ski the chute, which is very technical, and it's definitely a terrain track. It ends up in a fjord, and it's a winding chute, and the whole thing is avalanche terrain. Which one would you prefer to ski if you were the person to decide for yourself? And which one would you accept to ski if someone in your group said, I want to ski this, and nobody else objected? So if we just look descriptively, it's very clear that most people say that they prefer to ski the very safe runs, the ridge or the field, and very, very few wants to ski the chute. And if we look at what people say that they would accept to ski if someone in the group wanted to ski it, it's a similar distribution. But if we compare just the share who wants to ski the bowl or the chute here and here, it's a pretty large increase. And we also asked people about their perceived level of risk of skiing down each of these. And we tested, and the change is actually significant. So people are willing to ski down something that is significantly more risky in their own perception than they would prefer to ski. I don't find that very surprising, that we accept to do things that we do not prefer. I prefer that Martin always picks up the trash and always do the grocery shopping. And I will still accept that I will do it sometimes. But it's a whole different thing when we're out in the backcountry. And if I accept to do things that I don't prefer, that's an important change. When we run regressions for these two, so we run 2, one for preference for the risky runs and one for acceptance. And here I should say that, as you can see on this picture, we have very few people who would prefer or accept to ski the chute. And so it's really hard to do an estimation on that sample. So what we did is that we collapsed and made this into a safe choice or a risky choice. Not that I'm saying that the skiing the chute or the bowl is necessarily the wrong choice, because I might ski the bowl. It was a level 2. It's not super risky. We didn't want it to make it a crazy choice, just a slightly more risky one. And so we collapsed then, and we're only using people who perceive the risk and the bowl and the chute as strictly more risky than the field and the ridge. So if we look at these and we try to think about who is the person who prefers to ski one of these runs and who would accept it. Once again, we find kind of unsurprising results. People who say that they're willing to take risk are more likely to accept and prefer them. People who perceive the risk to be low are much more likely to ski them. And people who say that they admire other people who ski steep are more likely to both prefer and accept. So once again, some kind of indication of personal or social norms about steep skiing. What is surprising is that, or it's not very surprising that we find the people who perceive themselves as to be skilled in backcountry travel are much more likely to prefer to ski the steep runs. What is surprising is that we do not find a correlation between skill and acceptance to ski these runs. So people who state that they're novices in traveling in backcountry terrain, they're much less likely to prefer to ski the steep runs, but they're equally likely to accept to ski the runs. And that's kind of surprising. We do not find any correlation between avalanche training and preference for the steep runs, but we do find that people who has avalanche training are much less likely to accept to ski the steep runs. So once again, an indication that avalanche training, since we do not find any indication with the preference, that tells me that it shouldn't be interpreted as avalanche training has no effect, because we try to describe the avalanche hazard in a really simple way so that the risk was sort of clear. But this rather indicates that people who has avalanche training, if they don't prefer to ski it, they're not going to accept to ski it either. While people without avalanche training who don't prefer to ski it might accept to ski it. Two things here are interesting. So perceptions of risk is important. It's really important. So if you perceive the risk to be high, you're not likely to either accept or prefer it. While if you perceive it to be low, you're very likely to accept it. So that's interesting to sort of look into what determines perceived risk and what determines. I was also just curious to look at what determines how you perceive your own skills, because we ask people not what is your absolute level of skill, but how do you perceive yourself. So we looked at that, and it's concerning perceived risk. It's actually, we didn't find a lot that correlated with that. It's a lot of unexplained or uncertainty in that regression. But we find that, not surprisingly, the people who has a lot of experience, a lot of days, a lot of years, perceive the risk to be lower, and people who perceive their skills to be high perceive the risk to be lower. That's not unexpected, because if you're a good skier, you're going to be lighter on the snow, you know where the safe spots are. It's less likely that you will fall and trigger an avalanche, and you might be able to run out of it. Even if you're in an avalanche and it's big, it's not going to care if you're an expert. But this is really surprising, because we also asked people about the other people in their hypothetical group and the skill of those people. And we find the people who presumed that they were touring with someone who were more skilled than them perceive the risk to be lower. And if I'm out in the backcountry touring with someone who is an expert, a guide, I'm definitely going to feel safer, because I'm with someone whom I trust and who can make good decisions. I shouldn't put my life in their hands, but that's actually could be fair. But this is a strictly hypothetical scenario. We gave them all the information that we could, And we said, you cannot get any more information than this. And touring with a skilled partner in that scenario has no bearing whatsoever. They might be faster at saving you, perhaps. They will not trigger, perhaps not an avalanche above you. But this, we ask them, what is your perceived risk of skiing down this slope? You. And I don't understand this result. What is this about? Is this about that if we are usually, because we ask them about people that you like and usually tour with. If you usually tour with a person who is very skilled, does that mean that you are not as active in decision making and that you don't understand risk to the same extent? I don't know. It's just a speculation, but it's very puzzling. Concerning the backcountry skills, we find that people who are experienced and willing to take risk are more likely to perceive the risk, perceive themselves as experts than others. And we find that people with a lot of avalanche training perceive themselves as more skilled. But we also find that people who only had a one-day course or workshop almost perceive their skills as high as experts. Not the people with an AV1. They actually do not perceive their skills to be higher. But people with just a little bit of training, almost, I mean, if we compare, so 30%, 37% of the people with an AV1, AV2 or higher perceive themselves to be experts, and people with only an avalanche workshop, 32%. That's almost as high. That's really strange. And we also find that men with the same level of avalanche training, experience, and risk preferences perceive their skills to be a lot higher than women. We cannot control for the type of terrain that men and women ski, so it may be the case that with the same amount of days and years, men push themselves harder, go into more complex terrain and learn more. But it's still surprising that it is this high. So just to sum up, what do we find? We find that most people say that they prefer to ski relatively safe, but a lot of people would accept to ski a lot riskier. To some extent, we find that choices correlates with what I call like rational or risk mitigating factors. But we also find that both social factors and gender appear to matter. And I come back to this, that risk mitigation skills seem to increase slower than the cumulative risk. And I think that's important for us all, that we usually when we go out, we think about the risk that we expose to ourselves every day. And we don't think, when I'm out a lot, my cumulative risk increases really fast. And I have to make sure that my skills increase at the same time. There are definitely a lot of limitations to this research that I already talked about. And therefore, the way forward is super important. So what we want to do now is that we've had a survey out here in the US, and I know that a lot of avalanche centers has helped us to distribute this survey. We want to link that to GPS tracks to actually study what people do in the backcountry, not just what they say that they do. And we hope to also implement that in Russia. We translated to Russian, and it would be very interesting to look at it there. And we're also doing a set of experiments where we're trying to look at trend effects in perceived danger or risk. So if, for example, if the avalanche danger goes from 2 to 3 or 4 to 3, do we perceive that 3 as the same if it's described the same? Do we perceive how is relative inclination of the terrain that we're traveling in? If I'm judging a slope of 30 degrees, do I perceive it as less risky if everything around us, or if I'm used to traveling in a lot of steep terrain, or if I'm traveling in more mellow terrain? And we're also looking into how emotions, so for example, fear or stoke, when we're out traveling in the backcountry, how does that affect us when we're like, what do we pay attention to? And how risky do we perceive things to be? And if you're interested, we have a webpage, whiteheatproject.com, and you can also read about us from MSU site, the Snow Science site. Thank you.